My name is David Perley. I'm the director for the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center, and I am from Tobique First Nation, which is not too far from Grand Falls area. So I'm a Wolastoqey person from Tobique First Nation. I prefer to use my ancestral language, which in my language, in my Wolastoqey language, we would say Skijinuk, which means earth walkers. So everyone is actually a Skijin because everyone's an earth walker here. All two-leggeds and four-leggeds are earth walkers. So I like to use my own ancestral terminology, but when I'm in this context and I have to do reports and proposals and so on, I usually use Indigenous to mean that person who is originated from the territory. For me, it has two aspects to it, and I have to share with you my timeline of Indigenous education to understand why I use those two aspects and emphasize the two aspects. For me, when I look at the history of Wabanaki education or Indigenous education, or in my case, Wolastoqey education, I see the history in a circle and not linear. Most historical timelines are linear from starting point to end point, and you describe events between those 2 points. In my timeline, it's a circle because it's consistent with the worldviews of my ancestors. We have to ensure that whatever we put together, whatever we discuss, it has to be in terms of ancestral teachings. So my circle is consistent with that. It's a circle of life, and in the circle of life, of course, it promotes the principles of sharing resources, sharing ideas, sharing opinions. It's very important within that circle. And then the second principle is respect. Even at an early age, I was taught to respect our elders within our community. I was taught to respect the four-leggeds, the water people, the tree people, the plant people, father, son, grandmother, moon, So they were all part of my teachings as I was growing up within my community. So it's respecting all of creation. And within the community, it's also respecting one another. We have to. If you're going to have a unified, cohesive community, there has to be respect within that community. And my ancestors have found ways to ensure that you will have this harmony, which is the third principle, harmony of relationships. If you have in any community, if you have sharing of resources, sharing of feelings, and then you have respect for others, all of creation, then this will lead to harmonious relationships within the community. And the final principle within the circle of life that's promoted within our ancestral teachings is the principle of interconnectedness or balance. We're taught at an early age that we're all connected. We're connected to all of creation. We're not individuals that are separate from the four-leggeds or the winged people and the water people and so on. We're all related, all of us, So that's the idea behind interconnectedness. In my language, my elders taught me always to remember Sewudul Nabamak, which means all my relations. And it isn't just your relations in terms of the two-leggeds, but your relationships with the four-leggeds and the water people and so on. So if you're connected to all of creation, that will create a balance within creation. If you disrespect any part of creation, that causes a major imbalance in that creation. For example, let's take this river here, what is now called the St. John River. My ancestors identified that as Wolastoq. And Wolastoq means, in my language, the beautiful and bountiful river. And so I remember one time when I was growing up at Tobique, we were able to canoe downriver, and we were able to take our cup and then just dip into Wolastoq and drink from her. This was back in the 50s. Now you can't do that because all the waste going into Wolastoq waste from the pulp and paper mills. The dams are causing pollution within the river and so on. So it's at an imbalance now. So we have to find ways, and I try to convince the government too. We have to find ways to make Wolastoq healthy once again. So those are the four principles of the circle of life, and that's how I frame my timeline for first, Indigenous education, Wabanaki education. On the eastern direction of my timeline, that's the beginning of time. You know, my ancestors, they did not. Of course, they didn't. You know, they would never. At the time, they would never teach that we migrated from the Bering Strait theory. No, of course, their teaching was that we originated here in Wabanaki territory. Gluskop stories tell us that, and so our teachings tell us that we, contrary to what the Bering Strait theory informs us or tells us, my ancestors are saying, no, you have to remember that you're connected to this land. You're a Wolastoqey person, and as a Wolastoqey person, you are connected to the land of my ancestors, and you're connected to the river as well. So your identity is from your land and from your river. And of course, from that, you have your first language of the land is my ancestral language, Wolastoqey language. So that's important for us to remember in the eastern direction. It's beginning of time. From the eastern direction to the southern direction is what I call the Age of Independence. And during this time, during the Age of Independence, this is when my ancestors had full control of education. They had a traditional education system that they established and shaped in accordance with the culture of my ancestors. The worldviews shaped the education system of my ancestors. The value system also shaped the education system and so on. So the education that was provided, totally controlled by my ancestors, was an education designed to reconnect. Each succeeding generation would reconnect or help students to connect with creation. That was the primary purpose of education at that time. Now, within that education system, you also acquired the skills that you need to be a productive member of that society. So at that time, before contact with French settlers first and then later on English, at that time, my ancestors were primarily hunting and fishing societies, which means that if you're going to be a productive citizen of your community, of your society, then you had to acquire those skills. So teachers were available and teaching those skills, and they could be your parents, they could be your grandparents, they could be your uncle, your aunt, because it was a clan system, and each member of the clan system was a teacher. So their responsibility was to ensure that young person, could be a male or a female child, would acquire skills that he or she needed to be a productive member of that particular clan, and of course within society. So that was the major purpose of education at that time. Within the education system, it's also important to remember that as when they became adults, then they would have a strong identity of who they are. So if you become an adult at the age of maybe 16, 18 back in those days, then you were culturally grounded. You had a strong identity. You know who you were. You know who you were. You know your ancestors. You know your lineage. So that identity was an important part of the education as well. So you acquire those skills that you needed: hunting skills, fishing skills, and for women, in some cases, they were medicine people. In some cases, they were spiritual leaders, clan mothers, and so on. So you learn all of that in the traditional education system, so that when you become an adult, that maybe you're a leader in terms of the internal political system of our societies. So that's the education that was in place during the Age of Independence. Total control education system was grounded in the culture of my ancestors, the worldviews, the value system, the belief system, the knowledge system, the philosophies, and so on. They were all part of the education system that was in place before contact with European settlers. And then we had contact. So the southern direction is the point of contact. So you have the eastern direction as beginning of time, and south is the point of contact. Now, initially, the initial stages of contact with European settlers, the traditional education system did not change that much. There were some changes, but not to any degree. It didn't totally eliminate the education system. So initial contact, the traditional education system was still in place, but as soon as the numbers increased on Wabanaki territory, as soon as the French and the English became in terms of demographically, became the dominant force, the things started to change. All of a sudden, the policies adopted by the French, first of all, the French colonial authorities, was a policy of assimilation. They believed that the First Nations people, in this case the Wabanakis, they believed that they were savage people. Mm-hmm. So the French colonial authorities believed, well, we have to help those poor savage people. We'll assimilate them into our society, in our French society. And so there's documents that demonstrates, that proves that the intent of that education that they imposed on my ancestors was a policy of assimilation. Take them away from their language, take them away from their traditions, their ceremonies, and everything about them, because it's important for them to assimilate into French society. So that's the first, for me, that's what I call colonial education. Because colonial education, as defined and established by colonial authorities, was designed to attack anything that was Wabanaki, attack the language, attack the traditions, the worldviews, the knowledge systems, devalue them, and then make the attempt to totally erase that from their reality. So that's why for me colonial education is really destructive, and it has been for me personally. That's why I want to decolonize. But I'll get to that when we get to the northern direction. So we have this colonial education first imposed by the French colonial authorities, and then of course you had the English-French War, and the English became the dominant force in Wabanaki territory. And once they had control, then of course they imposed their education, once again colonial education, on the Wabanaki people, and again it's a policy of assimilation, because they also believe that they are superior to the Wabanaki people, therefore we'll assimilate them into our society, make English citizens of them. First you had the French colonial authorities wanted to make the Wabanakis French citizens. And then later on you had the English colonial authorities who wanted to make Wabanaki people English citizens. So once again it was colonial education, and of course the objective was the same: assimilate, attack the language, attack the culture, attack everything about the Wabanaki people. So then we had this is what I called age of colonial education, age of destruction. So, from the southern direction to the western direction is what I call age of destruction, pre-Confederation, and this is when colonial education was imposed on Wabanaki people. So then we reach the western direction, and this is where where Confederation occurred here in Canada, and as a result of Confederation, the Canadian government just continued the colonial policies of the French and the English, and then now the Canadian government is doing the same thing as the previous authorities. So the Indian Act was put in place. Of course, they had the authority to do that because of the BNA Act. Because the BNA Act, Section 9124 of the BNA Act, states that the federal government will be responsible for Aboriginal affairs across the country. So that gave them the authority to establish, pass what the Indian Act. And then in the Indian Act, sections 114 to 123 of the Indian Act states that the federal government, Minister of Indian Affairs, will be responsible for education across the country in Canada. So of course they had control of education. So as you can see, my ancestors had total control during the Age of Independence. We move on to the Age of Destruction, then we lose that control. And then we move on to the Age of Destruction post-Confederation, and we still lose that control because of the Indian Act, Indian Affairs Department. So of course, once they had control of the education of First Nations people across the country, then they formulated a policy of assimilation once again. And then within that policy, they established, to achieve the policy, they established these residential schools, Indian day schools, boarding schools, and they were all designed to take children away from the families of the Wabanaki people and then put them in these boarding schools, so that this way, most of these schools were established maybe miles and miles away from the First Nations, so the parents didn't have any contact with them for 1 full year, and this gave more control to the nuns, or it depends on the church. You know, it could be Pentecostal, Anglican, Catholic. But in all cases, they wanted to take children away from the families of the First Nations people. That's how you achieve assimilation. You know, because the families are the ones that will pass on culture. So now I believe that we're at the age of healing and revival, which means that in this age of healing and revival, because of the young people now telling us that they want to learn their language, because our language is in danger. The Wolastoqey language, and this is also true for the Mi'kmaq language, we're identified as an endangered language, which means that the only speakers within the community would be the elders. Younger generations will not be speaking the language fluently. They may know a few words, like Waliwan, Danagak, but they can't converse with the elders because of the language loss. So now, in recent years, young people are saying, I want to learn my language. That's part of my identity, that's who I am, and I want to learn my language. So they're making the case, or they're making the request, that when they attend schools, and public schools that is, then they're hoping that language would be offered so that they can also learn the language. They're asking the elders also within the communities to teach them as well. So you have two different, you have the community-based one that elders may be teaching language to the younger generations, and then on top of that you have the public schools, not all, but some public schools are offering other, depending on the area, the Mi'kmaq or Wolastoqey languages. So it's age of healing and Robbie. It's reviving our language, rebuilding our cultural foundation. Those policies during the Age of Destruction, pre-Confederation, post-Confederation, those policies chipped away at the foundation of my ancestors. During the Age of Independence, that foundation was intact because there was little, if any, contact with other societies, other nations. They had contact. The Mi'kmaq had contact with the Wolastoqey and also had contact with the Mohawks and so on. But you didn't see any assimilation of the Wabanaki people into Mohawk society, for example, or Ojibwe, because they respected one another. So, but it's happened under colonial government. So, healing and revival, reviving and rebuilding the cultural foundation. And I believe that if we're successful in rebuilding the cultural foundation of my ancestors, it will be healing to us. It's healing, and that's what Indigenous education does. If we go back to the principles of the traditional education system, then we'll be able to help our students to be proud of who they are once again. In colonial education, when they graduate, they have little, if any, knowledge about their history of the Wabanakis. They're not speakers of the language. They don't practice the traditions and the ceremonies of my ancestors. But if we can bring back certain aspects of Indigenous education, traditional education, and that to be part of the education of our children, then they will be proud of who they are. They'll have self-esteem, they'll have positive identity, and so on. So that's why it's healing for them. Because I remember in my own day, going through the education system, when I graduated, I was ashamed to be Indian because of the messages that I received from the teachers and the textbooks that were used by the teachers, defining us as savage, barbarous, heathen people. So that has an impact on your self-esteem. So we have to get away from colonial education and replace that with culturally based education in public schools. But if it's a First Nations school, then you have complete control of the curriculum that you put in place, because it doesn't have to adhere to provincial regulations. We can say, like the Mohawks, for example, they say what they're doing is they're on within the community. They have Mohawk education, and it's in the language. They practice traditions. All subject areas has Mohawk content and so on. So when they leave that particular school, then they have a strong cultural foundation, and that's what I like to see here in New Brunswick as well. So it's healing to the individuals, because they are proud of who they are, and they have positive self-esteem. And not only that, it's also healing for the communities, because when they graduate from here, from university, and as long as we help them to have a strong cultural foundation, then they can go back to their communities and be involved in a positive development, social development, economic development, cultural development, and so on. So it's healing to the communities as well. So that's how I see Indigenous education. Well, I guess for me, within the community, let's see, depending on the size of the community, like in my case, we're large enough in my community, home community. I'd like to see all of those principles I identified as part of the curriculum for my school in my community. And I'd like to see it not just from K to 4 in my case. It should be K to 12. So when they graduate from what we call the Master School in Tobic, when they graduate from Master School in grade 12, then they will have a strong cultural foundation. They will have language skills and so on. So I see that I see the future in having our own high school as well, middle school and high school. For public schools here in New Brunswick, I hope that the province of New Brunswick, the Department of Education, will ensure that you have a strong Mi'kmaq Wet'suwet'en content in the curriculum of the public school system as well. Because I believe that it isn't just the First Nation students that should know who they are. They can still acquire those skills, like in terms of writing skills, math skills, and science skills and all that, but they still have a strong cultural foundation. I'd like to see every single New Brunswick student know something about the history of the Wabanaki people. They should know that we are all treaty people. They should know that we made contributions in the history of New Brunswick. They should know that the residential schools were in place and the impacts it has on individuals and communities and so on. So for public schools, K to 12, there should be maybe Wabanaki studies right from K to 12, not just high school level. It has to be continuous. And this has to be for every single New Brunswick student, not just for our own Wabanaki students. And that's one of the complaints I had when I was at the education department back in the 90s. Because they were always saying, well, if we do this will be for our Mi'kmaq Wet'suwet'en students, language, for example. And I said, well, at the time my argument was that, well, it's nice to have this for our Mi'kmaq Wet'suwet'en students, but what about the other students? We had non-native students who were asking us, can we also learn the language? And I would have said yes, but the senior management of the department said no, it's only for the Mi'kmaq students or Wet'suwet'en students. I didn't agree with that policy. It's the same thing when they introduced Native Studies in New Brunswick. It was grade 12, and it was only for First Nation students. And I didn't agree with that policy as well, because if we're going to be creating a society where everyone understands one another, where you have respect for one another and the principles I mentioned earlier, then how can you deny them those teachings and create this harmonious society? They have, everyone, I think in my view, every single New Brunswick student should receive information about the Wabanaki people.